and welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 137. So today it's a full-on feedback session. We have 6 people sent in images and we're gonna, with varying degrees of questions and thoughts and approaches and what have you. So I think it should be quite a full, rich program today. If you're watching live, we're here live on YouTube at the moment, unless you happen to be watching the recordings, but in which case make sure you subscribe somewhere and click the little notification bell. Actually, if you're watching live and you haven't done that yet, do go and click the notification bell and subscribe as well, so you'll know about future episodes. But also, if you are watching live, we have comments section here. Not just the comments, we actually have the chat box thing. So tell me you're here, tell me who you are, tell me where you're from, tell me what the weather's like, and we'll get the chat going. Yeah, so that's pretty much what we've got coming up. So yes, welcome. I see we've got a few people in already. April says, hello everyone. 1 month of winter down, 2 to go. 1 month. Oh, yeah, you're feeling optimistic. It's the 22nd of January. I'd say there's still enough. Still another week or more of January to go. Got something here saying YouTube not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. As such, viewers will experience buffering. That's not so good. I don't know. There must be something kind of draining my connection at the moment. I don't know whether something's updating itself at the same time. So I do apologise if you happen to be getting much in the way of buffering going on. Meanwhile, where were we? Hopefully I'll try and carry on. Comments, yes. So Photo Bazaar. So that's Robert and Anne in Texas. Say howdy all from Texas. Maggie says, hello everyone. Dreich is the word for here today. And it is dreich. Dreich is a good Scots word, meaning kind of dull, overcast, damp, drizzly, bit grim, grey, depressing. Yeah, that pretty much well sums up the weather for today. Ben's joined us from an overcast Edinburgh. Says days are now an hour longer than they were at their shortest. This is true this far north up in Scotland. It's roughly almost about 15 minutes a week or thereabouts, the difference between sunrise and sunset each day. Roy says, greetings from cold Yorkshire. Meg says, hello everyone. Janet says, hello from Ontario. Stacey says, good morning all. Cold here in Hatboro, Pennsylvania. Supposed to be rain sometimes this afternoon. John says, good morning from a snowy Columbus, Ohio. Nadia is joining us from Dreich, Fife. She's using Dreich too. Stacey says, oh, by the way, Kim's your photographs online were fabulous. Oh, thank you very much. Yes, anybody who's been sort of following Facebook at the moment, I've had a whole series of photos going up, which I'm putting together a blog post, which I'll put up in the next week or so. So if you follow my blog, go and check that out. If you follow Facebook, go and take a look there. Pat's just made it in from Minehead, still very cold. Rosemary says, good morning one and all. That's from Pacific America, up in Washington State, I think. Where are we? Stacey, Maggie says looks fine just now. I think that's probably responding to the fact that there doesn't seem to be any buffering going on. Hope there isn't. I've still got this big yellow strip going across my screen at the moment saying not receiving enough video. So anyway, hope it sorts itself out. Where are we? April says around December the 21st winter starts. Right, so March 21st spring begins, so that's why you're saying it's a month, right? Okay, so you're going from the yes, so we're a month in that sense of winter. I just tend to think of January as a complete month of winter. Anne's joined us on a separate line saying good morning, welcome Anne, and April says she agrees with Stacey. Who said no snow so far, but we'll be happy for warmer weather. Right, okay, right. Conversation going on between people. So let's move on. We have people in, we have photos to look at. We still have a bit of streaming, even if I am slightly stuttery or buffering at all. So hopefully we will be able to move on. So what we're going to do then, for anybody who's new, who's just joining or watching, anyway, basically this entire episode and most of the coming episodes are going to be essentially about feedback, critique on photos. So feedback on questions on your photos. If you have any difficulties, I mean the whole podcast is called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, and it runs on the fact that we all have gaps in our understanding, but everybody has slightly different gaps. So whatever your gaps are, whether you're struggling with the technical side like aperture or shutter speed, or whether you're struggling with composition or lighting or editing, or some subtle nuance or things you've heard people use but you're never quite sure what they are, then this is the place to ask. You can send in your photos. You've got a photo, it's not quite working the way you want it to, you need a bit of feedback, send it in and I'll do my best to help. So that's what these podcasts are all about. So on to today then. We've had 6 people send in images. So we'll say, oh, Graham's joined us. Says, hi everyone. Hi Graham, glad you can make it. Graham's down in Devon, which is about 400 miles south from here, so generally tends to be a little bit warmer. I don't know whether it's any sunnier, although he's closer to Pat in Somerset, who's kind of just up about 60 miles or so. Right, okay, where are we going? So what are we going to start with? I think what we will start with April. Yes, April. So let me see here. So April sent in this photo. And so this photo was taken at sunset. My question is about the lighting. Does this appear too dark? I don't want to get it too bright because I don't want to lose the mood of the picture. How would you edit it to make it just right? Thank you. Okay, so this is a kind of classic problem that we often have with photos, is especially around sunset, dusk, this kind of stuff. So maybe the sky's starting to get some really nice colour in it, but if we adjust our camera to the sky, then what happens is the foreground can kind of become too dark. Whereas in this case, we've got lovely fields full of cows, horses in the background, some is that crops and stuff, maybe corn or something growing in the background. So there's various nice kind of bits in the foreground that you don't want to just lose into the shadows. But if you make the foreground bright enough, then we lose some of the colour in the sky. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can deal with this. Sometimes what you can do is, and this is easier if you've got a tripod, or you can stick the camera on a fence post or keep it steady, is to take 2 or 3 different photos at different, or rather the same photo but at different exposures, same scene at different exposures. So you do one where you expose for the sky, and then you do another where you expose for the midground or foreground, and maybe you do one either side of that as well, and then that gives you a range, and then that allows you to blend them together in your editing program like Photoshop. If you don't have the chance to do that, if you're hand holding it, the chances of getting them perfectly lined up are less. But what you can do, I mean, at the basic editing level, is you can still play with your curves. And so what I'll do, let's open this with Photoshop. And what I'll do is I'll just sort of show you a basic kind of editing way of playing with this. So we have our picture here. Now, supposing then what we want to do is let's just kind of darken the sky a little bit to bring out a bit more color there, and lighten the foreground a little bit as well. So what I can do, I didn't mean to press that one. If I go over here, I'm going to, on a separate layer here, I'm going to go to the curves level. Now the curves level allows me to, I can grab a corner, I can brighten it up like that, a bit like the levels, or I can darken it down like that, or I can kind of grab this and move it around a bit, and we can see it lightening and darkening. Now, if I start dragging this down to the right, what we see, look at the colour of the sky there, really starts to kind of enrichen up. Now, we go down too far, nice little strip of orange, but it's just too far, we've lost it. But when we do say something like a bit like that, I think that sky tends to look much more interesting. Now, the problem is we've then lost a chunk of the foreground, but what we can do is we can mask this. So in most editing programs, there's an option here where this little symbol here says curves. This is the mask. So if I go up and I select my paintbrush, over here I've got black and white. Now white will use the effect you've got, black will kind of paint out the effect, so you paint in the layer below. So in that case, if I just sort of run this back over here, you can see that what happens is essentially I've painted the foreground back in, so only the sky has stayed dark. Now, if I go up over here, we can see we paint up out the sky. Now, if I just, this is set to a sort of soft blend mode over here, so there's a hardness where it make it very hard or make it very soft. And by just making it soft, I can just kind of softly blend, so there isn't like a hard line. Maybe if I just make this a little bit smaller, I can just kind of, so that tree, bring that tree up something like, so that's not completely lost in silhouette. Now maybe I want to make the foreground a little bit lighter as well. So what I could do here is I could take the curves and I could brighten the foreground, but I don't want the sky. So now I do exactly the same thing. Using the black, I now paint the sky back in again. And so what we now have, now what I maybe this little bit of foreground here feels quite bright. So maybe I can just kind of paint a little bit of that in. So because we don't maybe need the foreground as bright, grabbing our attention. So now we've got this, we've got a much richer sky than we had. So if I just group those two together for a moment, and you can see the difference between essentially before and after. And what's happening now is the richer sky and also darkening it and bringing up the colour here, our eye gets drawn much more to the attention. And then if you wanted to take that a little bit further, if I select all that, put it into a fresh layer, then if you're playing around with camera raw a little bit or just want to kind of edge things up a bit, maybe I would give it a little bit of a vignette and perhaps maybe play around with my clarity a little bit, something like that. Just kind of feels like it kind of boosts that contrast a little bit more. And again, drop that into the group and your difference then between that and that. And you can see that it's kind of just really lifted the photo somewhat. Now, the only other thing I would say about this, April, is really, I think one of the things you've got here is, I think with the composition, part of the problem we have here is that there isn't anywhere specifically grabbing our eye where, you know, you've got these rather interesting, you know, nice cows in the foreground. There's some horses in the background. What happened there? Had my finger on the wrong button when I moved everything here. We've got some trees here, but because this tree's in the center and it's breaking the horizon, the tree tends to be what's grabbing our attention, but it isn't necessarily the most interesting part of it. What I would have said, and the cows here are off to one side. They're kind of brighter, so they grab the attention, but they're off to one side. And so there's kind of this sort of empty space in the middle where you would expect the eye to go. What I would have said here, just a kind of a wee thought, is, let's grab the pencil tool and put, just so I can draw a little line here. I would have said, if you moved round to the left, imagine you moved about 10 meters or so to the left, and then pointed the camera this direction. Okay. Now, what that would have done is you would have then had the cows more in the foreground. Maybe you could have shot between the cows, maybe going between the trees, picking up some of that lovely sunset behind as well. Also maybe getting in some of these crops. So you've got the crops, the trees, the cows, but I think you would have, but then these would have kind of come more into the middle of the photo, and I think that might have given you a more interesting composition. So even it's always worth moving to the left, moving to the right, maybe raising up or squatting down to sort of shift your perspective a bit and try and play around with the composition. However, I won't go on any more about that because that wasn't really your question. Your question was about the lightning and the darkening. So hopefully that's given you a few ideas there, April. But thanks very much for sending that one in. Okay, we've got a couple more comments come in. Where are we? Graham says it's freezing down. It's freezing down in Devon at the moment. Okay, so not too much warmer. Where are we? Stacey says lovely colours and farm photo. April says thanks. It belongs to the Amish. This farm, I think. April likes what I'm doing. Pat says don't like the cows. Don't know the cows. No, it's bedtime. When do they go to sleep if they're still outside? Meg says really lovely photo. April says I see the composition you're talking about. I can visualise it. Excellent. And Stacey's chatting a bit more about the Amish in Lancaster, near where she is. Where are we? And Rosemary says lovely sky, April. Okay, cool. Right, so thank you very much for sending that one in. Okay, let's move on then to Roy. Now, Roy, okay, let's talk a little bit. Because what Roy says here is, I've only just recently started shooting in RAW, then converted to JPEG. What do you think of the idea of members sending you a RAW image and the JPEG they produce from it for your advice on improving their processing technique and workflow? I realise that due to the size of RAW images, they cannot be emailed in the normal way and would need to be sent using WeTransfer or similar. Well, what I would say there is actually some of the members already do. Robert nearly always sends me the RAW file. Rosemary's pretty good at sending me the RAW file as well. But as you say, the RAW file tends to be really big. You can't post it in Facebook So you tend to have to send it to me separately. And if it's too big for your actual email itself, then something like WeTransfer or Dropbox, or even Google Docs or something like that is a way of sometimes putting bigger files. And I will say that if you want to send me your raw files of the original of when you're sending me the photo, that's really, really useful, because it helps me to get a better understanding of what could have been done with a photo. Sometimes if I'm only sent the photo after it's been edited, I'm not sure what other options might have been available. So that's always a good idea. And if you want to email me, then my address here, kimayres.co.uk, quite simply kim@kimayres.co.uk. That's the best way to email for me any of the images. Right, okay, so to go on. Roy has just started shooting in RAW. Now, I would recommend, if you have the option for it, to start exploring RAW if you don't do it already. The thing is with a JPEG, if you've got your camera set to JPEG, is that basically it sort of edits it for you. It compresses the image, it takes out some of the information it doesn't think is necessary. It maybe slightly sharpens and darkens, or contrasts and what have you. But what it means is that it loses information in the process, and it means if you want to make changes, you can't always go back and retrieve that information. Now a raw file keeps note of what every single pixel was saying at the time. It's not compressing it, so that means the file size tends to be larger, takes up more space on your computer, takes up more space on your camera. You can't take as many photos on your with your single card if you're shooting on RAW. But you do get to keep all the information, and that means when you come to the editing, you can retrieve a lot more of the information. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to show you. This was Roy's picture. Now this is his RAW conversion. So this was his first try, and he wanted to know whether he could have done anything better with it. So let me show you what happens. He sent me the RAW file. So here's the absolute RAW file unedited. So if I just click open on that, that's kind of more or less the equivalent of what you get with the JPEG, right? Now I've opened this, there's a limit to what I can do with it at this point. So what we find with this is that the highlights are somewhat blown out. If we move into we've not got a lot of detail in the water here. The where it's flowing here is the highlights are kind of blown. Also up here on the bridge, there's a little bit as well. Another thing to notice is we've got this little kind of purple edge here and a green edge here, and that's chromatic aberration. It's to do with the way the light cuts through the lens. And did you ever hold a little plastic ruler up to the window and when you were younger and kind of look through it and notice the kind of slight prism effect that it has? So as the light goes through the lens, sometimes you just get kind of shifts of where the light starts to separate. And this kind of purple-green effect is something that happens quite a lot. The other thing is that we're noticing quite a lot of noise as well. So once we've got this, anything we start doing to it, we've already lost a chunk of information. So now let's go back. Let's open this again. We're going to open sort of RAW, the second version of this RAW photo. Only now, before we actually close it and kind of compress it into what would then be the equivalent of a JPEG, we can start adjusting. So I've got all these little sliders here. Now I know Roy uses Affinity rather than Photoshop, but essentially you'll have a similar kind of layout. Even if you don't have exactly the same sliders, you'll have similar kind of ones. So I'm hoping you'll just be able to translate with what I'm talking about here. So we've got things like exposure, and we can lighten and we can darken and what have you. Now, given the fact that this is slightly brighter, I might just knock that exposure down a bit. And there's an option here for taking the highlights alone and bringing the highlights down. Now look what happens. I bring the highlights down, and when I come back to the water, we actually find there's a little bit more detail there than there was in the other one. So what that means is in the JPEG, the information in those highlights would have been lost completely. But here in the raw file, because we've still got all the information, we're able to retrieve a little bit more of it. And if I take that exposure down just a fraction more, we start to see a little bit more texture coming. Now, still quite a bit of noise. What I can also do here is if I go to the detail, I've got a detail with a sharpen and noise reduction. Now, I don't know whether it's the same with all of them. This seems to default for me to a sharpening at 40, which is always way too sharp. So I take the sharpening off, and you can immediately see the noise comes down. Although it has gone slightly blurred, I do a little bit of more noise reduction, but then bring the sharpening just a little bit back up. Now you play around until you find one that works for you. I mean, this is ISO 2000, so it's going to be a bit noisy to begin with. Let's go back to the basic. And what I can also do, and if we come into back to here just to kind of give myself a sense, I might play. I've got a texture and I've got a clarity tool here, and I might just, if I just pull that texture a little bit. Well, actually, I'll tell you what. I'll come back to I'll just do the texture a little bit and the clarity a little bit, but I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing I want to point out is that bit of, if we notice, there's this purple. Remember I said there's like this kind of at the edges, you know, tend to notice it specifically on where there's white. So I'll tell you what, let's move over to here where you can really see, which is on the bridge, right? So if I kind of come into here, you can really see this little purple bit. Now another bit we have in the raw file is, where are we? In the optics, I have a little bit called defringe just over here. And I can do purples and greens. And if I take this purple and I start to nudge it to the right, look what happens. That purple disappears. Now it kind of goes grey, but it's just sort of, if I go too far, but I just need to nudge it just enough to get rid of that purple. Now, I can do the same with the greens if I move that. But the problem is with that, because there's so much green in the trees, if I do that, it's going to affect all the trees and the growth and the ivy and the grass and everything. So I'm going to leave the green, but I am just going to take that purple down a little bit. So we can see that on a very subtle level, we've already managed to considerably adjust the photo and what we're doing to it. So now I can open that, and you can kind of see, in fact, I'll tell you what, let's just copy that and stick that on top of there. So we can now actually see the difference. And if we go back to where the water was, look how much difference we've managed to get in terms of texture back into that water. Now, supposing we wanted to add a bit more texture to that water, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to duplicate that layer. I can now here say go back into camera raw, and maybe I want to, but the problem is with texture, if I go to here, let me show you, if I kind of zoom in a bit here and I grab this texture, and I do, now that adds more to the water, but the problem is it tends to add more to everything. And now all these kind of grass and bits of leaves and stuff like that become overdone. So maybe what I might want to do is add in a bit of texture and clarity, click OK, but again, mask it. So I'm going to mask that off so that none of that's showing through. And then I'm just going to get my paintbrush, turn it to white, and then I'm going to kind of paint back in only where I want it to go. So if I do this, you can see that I'm starting to add some of that, more of that texture just back into where the water is, which is where I wanted it. I wanted that maybe just on there, a little bit, maybe just sort of bring a little bit out on some of these flagstones here or something like that. So I can be selective as to where I want it. So by creating the different layers, it allows you to do that. So we can also see that if we go up to the bridge, we've got a lot more detail in the bridge here than we had on the original file. And in fact, actually, if I take the texture on that, we can see that that actually brings that out even more. So really, the point of this then is to say, yes, start using the raw, because when you've got the raw file, you've got an awful lot more information to start playing around with. And so there's more places you can go with the editing. So hope that helps. And I mean, in terms of the rest of the editing, that's then entirely up to you. Although it isn't really tilted, the way that bridge slopes down a fraction kind of makes it feel a little bit. So I might just tilt that a fraction, might bring that up, you know, and then if you want, you can do color shifts and you can do balancing and you can play around with tones and all sorts of other things, whatever else you want to play with. But in terms of raw, yeah, get in there and play. And don't be afraid to also do 2 or 3 versions of the raw, overlay them and use the different abilities. You know, maybe you want to draw out the highlights information back out from the lost highlights in one, draw information out of the lost shadows in another, but just in a sort of slightly more patchy way, or selective way, not patchy way is what I meant. So I hope that helps. Hope that gives you a few ideas there, Roy. And also to anybody who hasn't shot in RAW because it just sort of feels a bit scary and unknown, I would say get in and play. There are YouTube videos all over the place about how to use RAW, which can give you kind of step-by-step instructions. So certainly worth playing with. So, okay. Rosemary says, Kim, when you are able to explain the impact of the sliders and the methods they utilise, it helps in applying the techniques on non-Photoshop editors, Affinity Zoner. Oh, well, that's good. I'm glad that's helping. Robert says, I like the composition. Neat curve. I too have chromatic aberrations. Nice to know how to fix it. Oh, good. I'm glad that's a new bit of info for you. Stacey says, I always try to get a layer of different photographs or add layers of the same. Yeah, it gives you options when you play around with the different layers, right? Okay, excellent. So thank you, Roy, for sending that one in. So next we're going to go to... Robert. Now, I thought I would show Robert next because actually Robert has sent me the RAW file, and this then will show you, I think, even better examples of why it's useful to use RAW and how you can use them for sort of doubling up your layers. So first of all, let's just show you what Robert did. So Robert sent this photo and said, I've been going through the past 2 years of my photos, only about 100,000 or so. I should be done by Christmas, by of course by which time you'll have another year's worth of photos. I found this gem and would like your help. I'm trying to make a juxtaposition between the guy on the phone and the statue of Lincoln. I made the crop a 4:6. It is a little bit noisy. Not sure how to clean it up and maintain the detail. I tried using neural filters on camera raw. I also made the photo 2 layers and edited them outside, and edited the outside and the Lincoln opening separately. So that's exactly what we were just talking about. So doing 1 layer for the darks and 1 layer for the lights. I've removed a jogger and a shadow on the right and have tried to fix the horizon, but I'm not certain about it either. Also, the open area on the right seems to be something that I should crop out. So what we've got here is this little area over here to the right of that. But I needed to keep the faces on the rule of thirds corner. I think it's a good juxtaposition, but I could use second opinion on how it can be improved. And then he came up with a second version where what he did was move this person over to the middle. And actually, I quite like that. I think that is a slightly better composition, having your guy looking at the phone sitting in the middle there. But what Robert did though is Robert sent me the original RAW. So that what that allows me to do is now double click on this and open it up. So what we can see here from the RAW file now is the original file is that it is quite a bit busier. We've got bloke running down the stairs here. We've still got our jogger sitting on the steps here. We've got another jogger running up the steps here. A couple over here. We've got our Lincoln Memorial. Well, what we can see, the light, the sandstone here is really almost blown out. You know, it's very, very white indeed. And trying to adjust here, we do have Lincoln in here, but he's looking pretty dark as well. But there's also, you know, quite a bit of noise on the inside. Even though this is ISO 100, what happens is the more we try and adjust it, the more noise we're going to get. So the first thing we're going to play with then is we're going to take down the highlights. And as soon as we take down the highlights, look what happens. Suddenly we get a whole load more texture rather beautifully into these highlights. So, you know, these lovely sandstone columns, which at normal are like that. The RAW file is allowing us to do this, which your JPEG just wouldn't. Then maybe what we want to do is we want to bring out a little bit more in the shadows. So if I go to the shadows and I pull that up, we can see here that, let's show, we're able to bring more detail out of what's going on in the background. Now maybe we don't want it as bright as that because we still want to have it, but something, maybe let's just bring the shadows up to something like that so we can see Lincoln a little bit more clearly. Oh, well, okay, I'll tell you what, we'll do this in two layers. We'll do that first of all, okay? Now, the other thing we want to do is, again, playing around with the noise. If I go to the detail, I'm going to take down that sharpening, bring up the noise reduction a little bit, and then bring the sharpening just back to a point whereby I feel we're getting sharp, but without getting too noisy. Now, it looks like this jogger was maybe slightly, if I can sharpen him up like that, but we end up with too much noise at that point. So here I'm just going to sort of sit that around there, and then I'm going to click open. We're going to see what we're going to do. Now, first thing is your crop. Now, your crop, if we go back to here, what you've done is you've cropped the other side of this column. And that part of that is because what you said you were trying to do was keep these faces on the rule of thirds corners. So if we do this, so what Robert is doing is he's not worrying about those little ones there. He's coming in like, sort of like this. And then if we do that, roughly at that point, what we notice is in our kind of rule of thirds, he's sitting at one point, he's sitting at another point. And that leaves this bit over here, but the whole thing feels unbalanced. Now, what I would say here, Robert, is the first thing to remember is rule of thirds is not a rule, it's a guideline. I got into a really interesting conversation with somebody recently about this, who was talking about the notion of rules of photography and breaking the rules. And I thought the whole framework is wrong. In a way, there isn't such a thing as rules of photography and then people breaking the rules. That whole notion of rule of thirds is just a phrase that messes everything up and gives people the wrong narrative structure on what photography is. What there is there are techniques. There are techniques of composition. And there are a whole bunch of different techniques. I talk about them all the time, from use of diagonals, leading lines, symmetry, rule of thirds being just one of them. And what you do is you have a whole range of techniques to choose from, and you use whichever techniques you need in order to maximize the impact of the photo that you've got, or to get across the story, the narrative, the mood, the feeling that you want to create from that photo. So there aren't rules, there are a bunch of techniques, and you use whatever techniques work. The only rule, the one rule of photography is, does it work? Does it do what you want it to? If you break that rule, then no, it doesn't. In which case, you haven't got the photo you want. So in a way, the only rule is, does it work? Everything else is a technique which is either going to help you do it or not do it. There is no hard and fast rule for any other kind of aspect of photography. So let's go back to here. And so when we look at this, you're right, fine. This Lincoln's head and the jogger's head over here might, or rather the phone guy's head, might well be in rule of thirds, but it doesn't sit right. So what can we do instead? I would say forget the idea of rule of thirds and actually go more for that symmetry or asymmetrical symmetry. So what we do here is let's pull these into the notion of the columns. Now at this point, this column, it's looking, I don't know, I think we're probably okay. Let's pull this up because you didn't want that bit. And then let's pull this down here, right? So actually, I'll tell you what we want to do. We want to kind of just make sure, do we need to tilt that? No, I don't think we need to tilt that. We will just go with it. These columns do look fractionally tilted, but I don't really want to ruin that horizon. If I just straighten there, no, that's going to look awful. That's going to, right. Oh, I will keep with that. Now, if I do this, right, fine. He's roughly at that rule of thirds. Lincoln no longer is. Does it matter? No, it doesn't, because actually what's more important here, I think, is going for that idea of the sort of asymmetrical symmetry. We're going to have a sort of symmetrical, let's just take that, maybe bring that down a little bit, something like that. Okay, so we've got the two gaps and we're going to use those gaps. Now, we can take this guy out, so let me just duplicate that layer. We'll just do this very quickly. You can obviously do it. I'm going to just use the little patch tool and take him out at the moment because and of course the shadow as well. So no sign that he was ever there. Then what we can do as well, what I really like, I liked it when you shifted this guy into the middle, because if we let's do that as well. Then let's just take this guy. Let's copy, paste. And again, we'll just do it roughly, but we'll move him over here and let's see, shove him in the middle of that. And then in this one, again, what we will do is we'll just use this tool to get rid of the original person there. There we go. So we've got a guy in the middle. Now, what that means is by creating that, we've got this one in the middle and we've got Lincoln in the middle. Okay, so that then is giving us an echo. We've got a kind of symmetry, or an asymmetrical symmetry, and that's really where the power of this photo works. And I think a composition like this is the one where it works the best. Okay, so now we've got the composition we wanted. Let's select all, copy paste. Right, so I'll put that onto a fresh one. Now we can start playing a little bit more around with Lincoln's a bit dark. Maybe these pillars are still a bit too bright. So what I'm going to do is let's just go back into filter camera raw, and let's darken down these pillars a little bit more. Take the highlights down a little bit, maybe bring the exposure down a fraction. So we're playing with texture. I'll tell you what we might also do is actually I might just throw in a little bit of vignetting, just fractionally, just to kind of draw our attention a little bit more into the middle of the photo. Now we've got this, but the problem is we have made Lincoln a little bit darker here. So at this point, what we might do is, if I Control T, I'm going to create another layer here, and let's go back to Lincoln in raw, and let's bring up the shadows. Now we've got the shadows, we bring them up, maybe even light in the middle. So we're just purely concentrating on getting Lincoln. Now we are getting noisier by doing this. So we go to the detail, we reduce the noise a little bit. And then, but what we can also do, if we go for the clarity tool and do something like that, that actually makes him stand out. It brings out more of the texture, makes a little bit more contrast, maybe something like that. I think that makes our Lincoln here look a little bit more. You might have to again balance slightly bit more noise reduction, but we do that. Now Lincoln's now looking great, but we've overdone everything else. So at this point what we do is let's grab the mask tool, we mask off Lincoln, and not that one, do it the other way around and do that. Now Lincoln is now lighter, but he's the only bit that's lighter. But actually it looks slightly odd. So I'll tell you what I might do here is, if I got the brush, and I'm going to drop the opacity down to about 30% just to see what happens. And if I do, wrong one, go to black, start bringing in the dark. Now I don't want too much dark. Now what I'll tell you what, if I do the dark at a very slight angle, like that, let's go back, let's do it a slight more of an angle, I think. Then it's going to look a little bit more like natural shadow in the background, I think, something like that. And then we come back here and we just want to kind of make sure that Lincoln's face is just making sure that's being highlighted. So you might play around a little bit like that. And so now you end up with this kind of photo, and I think at this point we're kind of well on to something. One other option, I'm going to select all, copy and paste. I'm just realizing here that actually I think part of this tilt could maybe be adjusted by, if I go Control T, and then if I grab this little bit of corner here and just pull this in a little bit like this, and what that's doing is just starting to straighten this column a little bit, and then I could just drag that in to the edge of that, and now everything feels slightly straighter with the columns, I think. But hopefully then, Robert, that kind of gives you the sense of what you can do. So I definitely think that shifting your guy with the phone into the middle makes a huge difference. Then really, that's what creates the story. Is the fact is you essentially have a guy on his phone looking very modern, but small, echoing a kind of sitting position of Lincoln looking very grand, big, and of course, 150 years old or whatever. This has been there for a while. So that then, I think you're now into a point whereby you're starting to move towards this. This is the kind of photo you enter into competitions. Because we've played around only subtly with this side where we've drawn the details out, we then played around with the getting rid of some of the noise. The whole thing, I think, if we go up to 100%, there's very little noise really to worry about. I think this is then perfectly printable. And perhaps if we come down here, you might even sort of selectively sharpen up this guy a little bit as well. Just not be careful about the edges because he has been cut out. But if you okay, tell you what, let's just show you. If we just go back into RAW for a moment. And we can see that he's slightly out of focus. So if I'm going to sharpen him a little bit more, something like that, and maybe do a little bit of texture or clarity just to kind of, but we're just purely doing him. We don't want all of that. So again, we mask that off and then just come down here and just paint that in over his face and his hands there with the phone, because that's the most important bit. Maybe a little bit of colour in his legs. Okay, so now you've got your photo, and I think that will work, and then you can play around. Maybe we don't need quite as much in the way of steps, even. And do something like that, have a slightly more cinematic, something like that. So I hope that helps, Robin. I hope that gives you some ideas of where you can go with that. But great idea, great photo, and I think that pretty much takes you to where you need to. Okay, so where are we now? We've got some comments. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, talking. Stacey says the monument is a great place to always wanted to visit. Brighton the Lincoln statue. I do love the columns. Anne says I like the diagonal from the smaller figure to Lincoln. Rosemary says agreed. I like the phone guy shifted to the middle too. It emphasises the symmetry. This is a fun image. Stacey also likes the symmetry details. Moving the guy to centre is a good balance. Ben says I like the symmetrical pillars composition, but I would be interested to try using a full height of the pillars to give us a series of sizes. Lincoln dwarfed by the pillars, the man dwarfed by Lincoln. I think that's I see where you're coming from with that, Ben. My feeling with that tends to be though that it kind of depends where it's going. If it's going to be printed, you could maybe get away with that. But if you're going to be looking on a computer screen, I think at that point your little man is going to, with the phone, is going to be so small as to be barely a blip. And sometimes you've got to work out what your composition is going to be depending on how the picture is being viewed. But it's a really good point, that. April says, I love how small the man is compared to Lincoln. Rosemary says, I like the final edit. The shading on Lincoln is excellent. Robert says, your edits are better and faster than the slower pixel pushing I was doing. Kudos. Well, I am doing fast edits. If I was going to be doing that, I would pay a little bit more attention to the details, but hopefully I'm giving you the direction to go in. Robert also says, one of the things I've been using lately is lowering the contrast by 35% and using clarity and dehazing to make it more natural. This is also suggested by a Dallas Club member. Okay, that's an interesting way of playing around with. I think so much kind of depends on the photo you've got, also what tools you're familiar with. But yeah, if you can find something that works for you, then absolutely, that's brilliant to use it. There's always 10,000 different ways to achieve almost anything, especially in Photoshop. Right, okay, so thank you very much, Robert. Let's move on then to John. Now, John from Ohio sent us in this photo, and so this is an older photo, 2018, that I always thought was a little eye-grabbing. However, it does not do well in the competitions. Any edits or comments are always appreciated. Now, part of the problem here, I did ask John if he could send a larger one, but he sent it through Facebook. Facebook already tends to reduce and make things smaller, so this is as big as it gets. So it doesn't really give me much to play with. And then if I kind of zoom in a bit, what we find is it starts pixelating up. But in essence, what we've got is, this is the photo. So what we can see here is then we've got this bright reddish pinkish ore with writing on it, sitting against in a couple of boats, and so it stands out. And we've talked before about the notion that red is this colour which grabs our attention pretty much before any other colour. It's the bit that we tends to be the one that our eyes get drawn to first. So it does that. So John's seen this, taken this photo. You know, you've got this diagonal that runs more or less, you know, pointing up corner to the corner. So in a way, there's ideas, there's aspects of it that should work, except it never seems to do well in the competitions. So I can't talk about the specific detail of this but what I tend to feel with this, John, just to give you a couple of little clues with this, is kind of, I think the problem is here is the ore is dominant and kind of too dominant for what it is. I don't think there's enough interest in the ore itself to take up that amount. It's one of these things where I think the picture kind of depends what it is you're going for. I mean, you have also in here, you know, there's this kind of the peeled paintwork, you know, that kind of old boat kind of stuff here, and it looks like probably there's bits of peeled paintwork on here. And in a way, I think if you're going to take an object such as an ore like this, we're back to that bit whereby you either go in closer or you go further back. And if you wanted to really pull out the detail of the texture of this whole idea of old paintwork, then really you want to get in close. You want to be kind of stepping into the boat if you can and getting, or if not macro shots, then certainly close-up shots, where what you're doing is you're kind of getting a bit of this red into and comparing it with all the texture of the paintwork in here. When we come out to here, this kind of just becomes so dominant we don't really notice much else. Now, the alternative to this is to go bigger. Now, I'm not going to be able to recreate this particularly, but what I want to do is just, supposing your picture was more like this size, right? Now, imagine then we've got the rest of the boat is quick sketches now. Let's imagine the rest of this boat is coming up here, coming around, joining on that. We've got this bit of boat coming down here. We've maybe got more water going on over here. And at this point, then your ore is grabbing the attention, but we've got a much bigger scene. And I don't think then the ore is overpowering it. You might still need something else, maybe something happening up here, which the ore is pointing to, or something interesting, maybe floating in the harbour there. There might need to be other elements. I wouldn't know until I saw it. But the thing is that I think that bright pink ore in that small space is just big and overpowering to the point whereby it kind of interferes and doesn't really allow it. It sort of over dominates without really fully delivering. Whereas I think if you've got the rest of that kind of more of the harbour, more of the boats, more of the sort of bits of the leaf floating in the boats, bits floating in the water of the harbour, and then you've got that ore, then I think maybe it would be a slightly more interesting or slightly more balanced photo. So not a lot more I think can really think to say about that, but I hope that gives you some ideas. In essence, I think that the ore is very, very dominant without necessarily delivering as much. What is it? It's an ore, but you need more context for that ore, or you need to go in closer to it and to really draw out that notion of the texture of the old flaking paint. So I hope that gives you a couple of ideas there, John. Right, okay, so just a quick reminder at this point that if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, or anything else, then you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Right, okay, let's move on. We've got a couple more to go through. So we've got Janet next. So Janet in Ontario sent in this photo, this snowy bridge. And Janet says, this is an old image, late February 2013, but it feels like an almost image. It was shot in the morning, close to work, after an overnight snowfall. I really do like snow, the bridge and the reflection, but it feels like I should have been able to do more with the scene. I did try colour correcting afterwards, but it still doesn't seem quite right. So, absolutely. So here we have Janet's photo, and it has all the elements that you want to have in a photo like this. We've got the bridge, we've got the river, we've got the reflection, we've got the snow, we've got the trees, we've got the texture. Everything seems to be there, but you're feeling it's not quite right. As you say, an almost photo. Now, I think this is the kind of photo where, first of all, non-photographers will go, oh, wow, look at that. Wish I had a photo like that. Photographers who are just sort of starting out going, oh yeah, oh that's a nice one, oh I'd like to get a scene like that. And then the more of kind of advanced you get with your photography, the more you start to go, oh well, maybe that needs to be tweaked slightly, that needs to be tweaked slightly, until you get to a point where, but as you say, it's got that feel of an almost photo. It's nearly there. A few little tweaks could actually make a difference to sort of just knock this up a level. Now, the image you've sent me isn't particularly big. I did ask you if you had the original file for it, but you said it was an old file, which and the original is kind of long since gone. But let me talk a little bit about something here. And so I think that the two things I'm going to talk about. One is essentially the crop, the overall composition, and the other is going to be the colour. So the first thing is the notion of the crop. And what I'm kind of feeling here is if I click here and we do this, when you've got a reflection in the river, I get very, very tempted to, again, forget the notion of rule of thirds as such. Start thinking symmetry. We want to have the symmetry between the bridge and the reflection. Now, one of the other things is here is because of the way, if I zoom in, because of the way the riverbank goes up here, that goes up a little bit here, and then these fence posts feel slightly tilted as well. Now, they might naturally have been like that, but I think to correct it, we just need to kind of nudge this just a little bit. Just kind of, what have we got there? Less than 1 degree clockwise. Let's just go back to 0.6, just over half a degree. And if I do that now, suddenly that feels slightly more natural. Now, the other thing I would do is I want to take this up. I want to bring this up a little bit, because two things going on here. One is I think we want to have this circle of reflection in the middle of the photo. But the other thing is this embankment of white snow on the right is rather dominant. This bright patch is grabbing our eye. We don't want as much of that. So if we pull this up, we have the dual effect of managing to reduce some of that unnecessary white embankment, but also we start bringing this into the middle. And again, kind of can just bring that down a bit, just tuck those edges in, a little bit like that. And now what we have is we're kind of going for this sits more or less comfortably in the middle. Maybe I might just turn that a fraction more. Yeah, that play around with that. But anyway, so now what we have is this. So we've got a much more symmetrical feel to it. It's not absolutely symmetrical because we have these little embankment, the trees here turn off, you know, but we've got a close to symmetry, and that I've talked before in these about sort of almost asymmetrical symmetry, this notion of symmetry but not quite, and that's something really satisfying. Symmetry but not quite is more satisfying than absolute symmetry. Absolute symmetry actually tends to be quite boring, but symmetry but not quite is the really interesting bit, and that's what you've got here now. Now we've got this picture, and I think this works kind of better in terms of composition. There's the colour. Now the whole colour shift of this is kind of is into the browns. And what I can't help but feel is when you've got a winter scene like this, you really want to have the blue. So there's a couple of different ways of doing this. I'm just going to duplicate this. Sometimes it's worth just going to auto colour. So if I go up to image here and go auto colour and see what that does. And that's okay. It's made it slightly greyish, I think. So I'm going to undo that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Camera Raw, which gives me a kind of quick fix with the sliders. And up here we've got a temperature thing here. And if I can go from greens to purples, which aren't really relevant to this, and I can go from yellows to blues, which look more where we're wanting to go. And so this one. So I'm going to grab this blue slide, and I'm just going to start nudging it to the left until we get to a point whereby about here we're starting to get, now if I go too far, that's too blue. Now we've overkill, but come back here, it's too brown, and so we're looking for somewhere, and so you kind of nudge it backwards and forwards to something like this. I think maybe just a touch more or less there, and now we've got the blue, that cold blue. We've still got browns in the wood. We haven't lost them, so we've managed to keep some of them, but we've brought in that kind of cool blue flavour to it, and I think at this point we've got a sort of a more interesting photo. Now again, depending on whether you wanted to edit it any further, because we're trying to draw attention to the bridge, we might again just give it a very slight little vignette there, which just kind of dark, again darkens down this corner a fraction, and then maybe again nudge the clarity tool just a fraction, just to kind of pull out. Oh, what about the contrast? No, I think contrast is too strong. I'll just do the clarity a little bit, something like that. And now we've got our picture and it stands out. So we've gone, well, not just from that to that, but our original photo is this, and we've taken it to this. So I hope that helps, Janet. So the two key things here, I think, are, first of all, actually allowing that bridge to be in the middle so that you really do play with the symmetry, which you can do because the rest of it is sort of asymmetrical. So we're not getting too worried about it just becoming kind of boring symmetry. But if you're going to do that with something like a bridge, I think having that in the middle of the photo is really where you want to be, rather than worrying about up or down rule of thirds, because that's where our attention is getting drawn to. And the second bit being that notion of the colour, that over in the yellows, it was just looking a bit too kind of more sepia. It was looking like an old photo rather than a kind of that cool, fresh snow feeling, where you tend to need to be in the blue end of the spectrum for that. So hope that helps. So let's close that. Where are we? Oh, April says there's a vintage feel to this one. Nadia says, lovely picture. Robert says, I wished it snowed in Texas more often. I never get shots like this. You're just going to have to move north, aren't you? John says, brilliant, thanks. Oh, glad that was useful, John. Rosemary says, by adjusting the tilt, the reflections are vertically aligned, so it works better. And Ben says, for levelling, the trees and their reflections provide a reference for what is vertical. A particular part of the tree should be on the same vertical as its reflection. Now, that's a really good point, Ben, and you know, that's something, you know, I'm kind of judging it by eye there. But yes, as I have said before, in that sometimes rather than worrying too much about whether the horizon is straight, worry about whether your verticals are straight if you're wanting the whole image to kind of feel a bit more straight. And certainly, as you say, with the reflections, what you're looking for is that the reflections are perpendicular, are level on the vertical. Meg says, absolutely stunning photo. Ben says, Rosemary beat me to it by half a second, because he also said about the vertically aligned working better. April says beautiful. Stacey says, I'm not a big fan of snow. Stacey's not so fond of the snow because of all the shoveling and everything. You get a lot more of it in Pennsylvania. Rosemary says, beautiful, serene scene. Stacey does like the snow in the parks and forests. And Janet says, I do like the colour change, hoping to get more winter scenes this week. Thanks. Okay, excellent. Right. So what we're going to do now then, we've got one more photo to go for, and this is Anne. So Anne, also in Texas, sent through this photo, nice black and white of essentially the lonely tree sitting there. I do like the conversion to black and white there, but she goes on to say, this is a photo I took in California, north of Los Angeles and close to Bakersfield. I've gone back to this photo several times and I can't get it right. Right now I've landed a black and white version. Do you have any suggestions on the crop and the edits for a colour version? I've attached the original and the black and white. So this here is the original colour version of it. And so Anne's seen this tree, leapt out of the car, or maybe just on a walk or whatever, taken the photo and feels there's something. And sometimes the notion of the lonely tree can be sort of thrown forward as a kind of quick cliche, but it's there because there's something always slightly grabbing about it. You see a tree in a kind of an otherwise empty expanse and it kind of grabs you somewhat. And so Anne's got this photo and she wants to know how to make the best of it. So what she's done is, at the moment, we're sitting a kind of rule of thirds, roughly with the horizon and with the tree to one side. Not obviously. And I'd like to say, I do like your conversion. I like the texture in the sky. But there is a sort of sense of, and I know what you mean, that it's sort of nearly there, but it's kind of difficult. Now, there's, maybe if you had a horse standing here, that would sort of balance it out a little bit, but there isn't a horse. So what can we do other than photoshopping a horse in? Which I'm not really advocating at this point. So let's close this for the moment, and this, and let's bring in your color photo. So now the first thing you, as you say, you're wanting to do is, there's a fence here, there's a bit of tree there, a little bit of shadow there. We don't need any of those things, so that's fine. We can do that. We can bring that down a bit. We can bring that in a bit, and if we bring that to there, then we end up with kind of more or less the picture you've got. And then I suppose maybe we bring that up a little bit more. I suppose what we're probably doing is kind of getting your horizon around that thirds or something like that. So that gives us our starting point. Now, one of the things I would say, though, is the notion of the tree on the horizon. And I don't know whether you're ever going back there or whether you see anything like this, but what I tend to feel is that this tree isn't quite on the horizon. If we look here, the tree is just below the horizon. And sometimes something like this can make slightly more impact if it's actually on the horizon, or even slightly behind the horizon, but say on the horizon. And for that, all you really needed to do, I mean, if we go back to the original photo here and I look at this, and we're looking down at this fence. Looks like there's maybe a little bit of a ditch, but I think if you're in a truck or you're standing on the side of the road, if you were to squat down or go down into that ditch a little bit and get down kind of level with where that fence is, either just on top of the fence or maybe through one or two of these little bits of wire, and you would angle yourself and actually allow then that tree to be on the horizon itself. And I think that would actually make a little bit of a difference. So if we come here, let me I'll just duplicate this layer here. Now, I'm not going to get it exact, but to give you an idea, if I'm going to copy that bit here, and I'm going to come down and I'm going to place that, I'm going to start copying. So what we do is we actually create the horizon. Now, you need to go in and tidy it up properly, obviously. And then what we'll do here is we'll do a similar thing here. And now, not perfect. Doesn't have to be. All I'm really trying to do here is show you the idea of what happens if you move that horizon. Okay, let's just tidy that up a little bit. Something like that. Now, I think when you've actually got the tree on the horizon, as opposed to the horizon running through the tree, I think you're immediately into something that just, it sort of elevates it a little bit more. You really get that feeling of it's, you know. So, and to achieve that, all you really needed to do from this was to be standing down that little bit lower in order to get that actually onto the horizon. Now, whether you want to muck around with Photoshop and tidy up an horizon, you know, I mean, I've just done that very, very quickly. You could spend 10 minutes, 20 minutes or whatever playing around and just make it a little bit more convincing. But I think you can see from the rough job, I would say in an ideal world, I would say if you can, if you're at that point whereby it's quite close to the horizon, just lower yourself down and you immediately get a bit more of a get it onto the horizon. And I think it does become more interesting. Now, the other thing is whether you want to have this sort of rule of thirds bit here, because actually you end up with a big bit of space. And I wonder whether a shot like this might even work better off going for a slightly more central. I mean, you can still keep it, you know, if you want to keep it landscape, you can, you know, bring it out something. But again, maybe you don't need a lot of horizon. If you, at this point, you don't necessarily have to have the horizon on thirds, but, you know, oh, maybe that's probably not quite, but something like that. But actually have your tree in the middle. I don't think is too bad. Another option here is if you actually went for a square crop. That's just something like that. Now, it might be too close in there. But actually, I think let's go back a couple of stages here. I think let's try again with a square crop and make a slightly larger square to begin with, and then I can play around with it. You know, but again, what's then making it interesting is the fact that it's directly on the horizon in a way that sort of below the horizon isn't going to. And at this point then, depending on how you want to play with it, you know, I think your notion of, I don't know what you did for the black and white there, but if you were taking down the sky a little bit like that, maybe boost the greens, yellows, you know, let's bring that up a little bit. And then let's put this onto here, and then I'll do a quick play around in Photoshop. Bring the exposure up a little bit and play with the clarity, maybe get a little bit of vignetting in again, something like that. And I think you kind of, oh actually maybe we want contrast, a bit more contrast I think with something like that. Actually, to be honest, I think your conversion was better, but then you spent more time on it than I did. However, in terms of composition, I think maybe something, because there isn't, you don't have other stuff in the composition. Now, that notion, if we go back to your photo here, the tree is there, but the tree is, there's this big space on the left. And this big space on the left kind of feels like it needs something in it. You know, you do need something like a horse or a cow, or up in the sky you need a bird or a flock of birds or something flying over. The alternative, to go back to what we said about either being too close or being too far away, is to go much more, where you kind of get in more sky. And you make the tree, we go for that minimalist. I'll do the content aware, hopefully should work on this. We'll sort of see how that's, it's not really done much with the sky. So let's just get a bit more sky rather than grass in the bottom. But if you've got, you can see here that actually if you make more of the fact that then it's a tree on its own, and you've got a bigger sky, and then I think at that point that emphasizes the loneliness of the tree. That emphasizes the notion of this sort of single interesting shape and object in a large space where nothing else is particularly happening. Failing that, if it's about the shape of the tree itself, then we're wanting to kind of make a thing about the shape. I keep looking at your, right, I need to lighten that. Let's bring that up, that's it. Then it's about creating a square, because that's what's interesting. But then there's also this sense of, I think, this idea of having it on the tip of the, just on the horizon itself, rather than, certainly I think if you're doing the bigger one with this, again, would benefit from being on the horizon rather than just in front of the horizon. So I hope that gives you a few ideas, Anne. A lovely photo and great kind of starting point, but I think really the key takeaway points from that is where your horizon line is, and then what's happening with the tree. Either you're wanting to be, the tree is the focus itself and you like the shape of it, so you may as well go square and just make the most of that, or the tree lost in the large expanse, in which case you kind of need more sky to sort of and give that sense of more around that little bit of, so the tree looks smaller within its environment. So hope that helps. Right, comments here. What have we got? Oh, Graham said, very nice, made me feel even colder. I think that's the blue shift. April says, the famous lone tree photo, I like the close-up version, and laughs at the idea of having a cow in it. Graham says, nice image, and says, fixing the horizon gives the photo more drama. April says, I do like the black and white look for this one better. Rosemary says, personally, I like the empty space for creating a sense of loneliness. And thanks to everyone for sharing their images this week. Great edits, Kim. Always good things to learn. And Robert, I want to give the negative contrast, positive clarity texture a try. April says, or you can write saying next to it. Oh, you could write, yeah, you've got space there to write greetings or Happy New Year, or could become inspirational. Have your little inspirational quote next to the tree. Yeah. And Anne says thanks. Right, okay, so that brings us to the end of this episode. Make sure you so next week again we are on to critique. Send me your images. This is your chance to really grow your understanding of photography and improve your photos. So you've got photos, you're not sure where your sticking points are, you want improvement. This is one of the best ways you can improve your photography, is to get feedback on your photography, but also questions as well. Send in your questions, send in your images. If you're on Facebook, there's a Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Send your images to there. If you're not on Facebook, or you want to send me the raw files, then kim@kimayres.co.uk is the way to do it. And also, if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can support them. Right, that brings us to an end. Pat saying Woody is slightly ballistic. I'm having fun there, noticing the little mannequin in the background. Have a good week. Send me your images, and I'll see you all next Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.